The Cotton Club on West 142nd Street was at capacity that Monday evening, September 16th, 1935, when the confrontation that would reshape Harlem's criminal landscape for the next 3 decades began not with gunfire or violence, but with words. Words delivered so loudly that 200 patrons stopped their conversations mid-sentence. Words so venomous that the Duke Ellington Orchestra faltered and went silent. Words so calculated in their racist contempt that witnesses would recall them verbatim 40 years later, when interviewed about what triggered the events that followed. Dutch Schultz, the most powerful white gangster in New York, stood in the center of the Cotton Club's main room, his face flushed red from expensive bourbon and rage, pointing at a table near the back wall where Ellsworth Raymond Johnson sat alone, quietly nursing a drink and watching the show with the patient attention he brought to everything he did. Schultz's voice carried across the suddenly silent room with perfect clarity as he screamed racial epithets that made even the Cotton Club's jaded crowd uncomfortable, as he declared that colored gangsters were nothing but servants pretending to be criminals, as he announced that Harlem belonged to him now, and that anyone who challenged his authority would be destroyed. Johnson did not stand, did not reach for the weapon everyone knew he carried, did not make any threatening gesture or speak any response. He simply looked up at Schultz with eyes that revealed nothing, waited for the tirade to finish, and then spoke 7 words in a voice so quiet that people at nearby tables had to strain to hear. 7 days. Then your people start dying. What happened next? The systematic elimination of Schultz's Harlem operation through a combination of strategic violence and community organizing that demonstrated Bumpy Johnson was not merely a gangster, but a revolutionary thinker who understood power in ways that would influence civil rights organizing for generations. Began with those 7 words and unfolded over the following week with such precision and such devastating effectiveness that it shocked not just Harlem, but the entire criminal underworld of New York City. The shock was not that Johnson fought back. Everyone expected retaliation. The shock was how Johnson fought back, using methods that no gangster had employed before, transforming what should have been a straightforward gang war into something far more complex and far more dangerous for Dutch Schultz than any amount of traditional violence could have accomplished. To understand why Johnson's response shocked Harlem, one must first understand what Dutch Schultz represented and why his presence in Harlem generated the kind of resentment that made Johnson's 7-day campaign possible. Arthur Flegenheimer, who had adopted the name Dutch Schultz for reasons that remain unclear, had built his fortune during Prohibition by controlling beer distribution throughout the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. When Prohibition ended in December 1933, Schultz needed new revenue sources to replace the bootlegging profits that had made him wealthy. He identified Harlem's numbers racket, the policy operations that generated millions of dollars annually from small bets placed by working people hopping to hit winning combinations, as the perfect target for expansion. The numbers racket in Harlem had been controlled primarily by colored operators, including the legendary Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madame Queen, and various other independent operators who had built businesses serving Harlem's community for decades. These operators were criminals certainly, but they were Harlem criminals, people who lived in the neighborhood, who spent their money in Harlem businesses, who supported community institutions, who maintained order in ways that benefited residents even as they ran illegal gambling operations. When Dutch Schultz decided to take over Harlem's numbers operations in early 1934, he did not attempt partnership or negotiation. He used force. His men beat runners who refused to work for him. His enforcers destroyed policy banks that would not surrender to his control. His organization systematically drove out the colored operators who had built the business, replacing them with white management that treated Harlem as occupied territory to be exploited rather than as a community to be served. By September 1935, Schultz controlled approximately 80% of Harlem's numbers operations. Most of the original colored operators had been forced out, had accepted subordinate positions working for Schultz, or had been killed. Stephanie St. Clair had retired from active operations after Schultz made clear he would destroy anyone who resisted. Caspar Holstein, another major colored operator, had been driven from business through intimidation and violence. Only a few independent colored operators remained, and the most significant of these was Bumpy Johnson. Johnson had worked for Madame Queen during her prime years, and had learned from her that policy operations required more than criminal skills. They required community relationships, political connections, and most importantly an understanding that operators who served the community earned protection that operators who exploited the community could never purchase. When Schultz forced St. Clair into retirement, Johnson had maintained his own small independent operation, controlling perhaps 15% of Harlem's numbers business through a combination of competence, community respect, and reputation for dangerous competence when challenged. Schultz had tolerated Johnson's independence for 18 months, apparently calculating that eliminating one relatively small operator was not worth the effort required. But by September 1935, Schultz had decided that total control of Harlem required eliminating all remaining independent operators, and that meant eliminating Bumpy Johnson. The confrontation at the Cotton Club on Monday evening, September 16th, was designed to accomplish that elimination through public humiliation that would destroy Johnson's reputation and force him to either submit to Schultz's authority or leave Harlem entirely. Schultz had calculated that a colored gangster, when publicly humiliated by a white gangster in front of 200 witnesses, would be unable to maintain credibility or authority in the community. He expected Johnson to either accept subordinate status or to respond with immediate violence that would give Schultz justification to destroy Johnson's organization completely. What Schultz had not calculated was that Johnson would respond in ways that transformed the confrontation from personal conflict into community uprising. Johnson left the Cotton Club that Monday evening at approximately 9:30. Walking out into Harlem's September night with his face revealing nothing, his pace unhurried, giving no indication to anyone watching whether Schultz's public humiliation had accomplished its intended effect. William Hewlett, Johnson's bodyguard and closest associate, walked beside him, expecting instructions, expecting Johnson to immediately begin planning retaliation. Instead, Johnson walked 6 blocks in complete silence before finally speaking. Hewlett later recounted this conversation in testimony given to investigators years afterward. Bumpy didn't say anything for maybe 20 minutes, Hewlett recalled. We just walked through Harlem, him thinking, me waiting. Finally, he stopped on the corner of Lenox Avenue and 139th Street and he said, Dutch Schultz just made the worst mistake of his life. He thinks embarrassing me in front of white people makes me weak in Harlem. He doesn't understand that embarrassing me in front of those people makes Harlem angry. He gave me something I couldn't buy and couldn't create on my own. He gave me Harlem's rage. Now I'm going to show him what happens when you give Harlem a reason to fight. By midnight Monday, Johnson had assembled approximately 20 people at his office above the Palm Cafe on 125th Street. The group included his top criminal associates, men who ran policy banks and enforced collections and handled the operational details of Johnson's business. But the group also included people who were not criminals. Reverend James Mitchell from Abyssinian Baptist Church, Marcus Thompson, who owned several legitimate businesses in Harlem, Sarah Washington, who operated a community organization that helped families facing eviction or economic hardship, Theodore Green, an attorney who handled Johnson's legal matters and who maintained connections throughout Harlem's professional class. Johnson spoke for approximately 30 minutes, explaining what had happened at the Cotton Club and laying out a plan that shocked everyone present because it went far beyond traditional gang warfare into territory that combined criminal violence with community organizing in ways that had never been attempted. Johnson explained that Dutch Schultz's Harlem operation depended on three essential elements. First, his collectors and enforcers, the white men who traveled through Harlem extracting money from runners and intimidating anyone who resisted. Second, his policy banks, the locations where bets were recorded and money was processed. Third, his political protection, the corrupt police officials and politicians who ignored his illegal activities in exchange for regular payoffs. Johnson stated that over the next 7 days, all three elements would be systematically destroyed through coordinated action that would combine traditional violence against Schultz's enforcers with community pressure that would make operating in Harlem impossible for any white criminal organization. The plan had multiple components that would be implemented simultaneously. First, 8 of Schultz's key Harlem operatives would be killed, 1 per day for 8 days, in ways that demonstrated these were not random murders but systematic elimination of specific targets. The killings would be accompanied by messages making clear why these men were dying and who would die next, creating psychological pressure that would terrify Schultz's remaining people and make continuing to work in Harlem seem suicidal. Second, Harlem's community would be mobilized to make Schultz's operations impossible through nonviolent resistance. Store owners would refuse to allow Schultz's policy banks to operate in their buildings. Residents would stop playing numbers with Schultz's operation, starving his business of revenue. Police would be pressured through political connections and through public attention to actually enforce laws against Schultz's operations rather than accepting bribes to ignore them. Third, and this was the element that most shocked the people at Monday night's meeting, Johnson would publicize what was happening through Negro newspapers and through community networks, turning the conflict from a gang war into a community uprising against white exploitation. The story would be framed not as Bumpy Johnson fighting Dutch Schultz for control of criminal operations, but as Harlem resisting white gangsters who had invaded the community, who treated residents with contempt, who extracted wealth while giving nothing back. This framing would generate community support that would protect Johnson's people while isolating Schultz's organization. Several people at the meeting questioned whether Johnson's plan was too complex, whether simpler retaliation through direct violence would be more effective. Johnson's response revealed the strategic sophistication that would make his campaign successful. Johnson said, according to multiple witnesses, "If I just kill Dutch Schultz's people, that's a gang war that might last months, and that will get people killed who don't deserve to die. If I mobilize Harlem to reject Schultz's operation while also killing his key people, that's a community uprising that will drive him out in days because he can't fight an entire neighborhood. Schultz thinks Harlem is weak because we're colored and he's white. I'm going to show him that Harlem is strong precisely because we're a community and he's an outsider." The first execution occurred at 6:23 Tuesday morning, September 17th, less than 9 hours after Johnson had given the kill order. Vincent "Clutch" Malone, one of Schultz's most effective policy collectors in central Harlem, was found stuffed in a garbage barrel behind a warehouse on West 145th Street. Malone had been tortured extensively before being killed, his hands crushed, his face beaten unrecognizable, his throat cut so deeply that the blade had scraped against vertebrae. Pinned to his shirt was a note written in block letters, "1 down, 7 to go. Leave Harlem." The note was addressed to Dutch Schultz but was written in a way that made clear this was not merely personal retaliation, but was a campaign with specific objectives and specific timeline. By Tuesday afternoon, every criminal operator in Harlem knew about Malone's death and about the note, and speculation began immediately about who would be next and whether Schultz's other people would continue working in Harlem knowing they were targets. Schultz's response was predictable and ultimately ineffective. He offered money for information about who had killed Malone. He threatened retaliation against anyone protecting Johnson. He sent additional enforcers into Harlem to demonstrate that he would not be intimidated. But Harlem refused to cooperate. Nobody would provide information about the killing. Nobody would help Schultz's people locate Johnson or his associates. The additional enforcers found that simply being white men walking through Harlem had become dangerous, as groups of colored men would gather wherever they appeared, not attacking directly but creating an atmosphere of barely controlled hostility that made continuing their work impossible. Wednesday morning brought the second execution. Raymond "Red" Sullivan, one of Schultz's lieutenants who coordinated policy bank operations in eastern Harlem, was found shot in the back of the head in an abandoned building on Lenox Avenue. His 2 bodyguards, assigned to protect him after Malone's death, were found nearby, both shot multiple times in what appeared to be a brief gunfight they had lost decisively. The note pinned to Sullivan's body read, "2 down, 6 to go. Every day you stay in Harlem, another one dies. Leave now." The pattern was clear. 1 execution per day, each victim a key operative in Schultz's Harlem organization, each death accompanied by a note counting down remaining targets and demanding withdrawal. The psychological impact on Schultz's remaining people was devastating. They understood that 6 more of them were marked for death, that hiding or using bodyguards had proven ineffective, that Johnson's people were systematically working through a list and would continue until all targets were eliminated or until Schultz withdrew from Harlem completely. By Wednesday evening, several of Schultz's Harlem operatives were demanding reassignment to other territories or were simply quitting rather than waiting to be killed. Thursday brought the 3rd execution. Thomas "Little Tommy" Brennan was found in his apartment, stabbed 17 times with an ice pick in the same methodical torture style that had characterized Malone's death. The note read, "3 down, 5 to go, last chance to leave." Friday brought 2 more executions, accelerating the pace and intensifying the pressure. Anthony "Little Tony" Benedetto was beaten to death in an alley. Joseph "Joey Numbers" Catalano was shot in the face in a crowded restaurant while dozens of witnesses watched 2 colored men calmly walk in, execute him, and walk out before anyone could react. The notes continued the countdown. 5 down, 3 to go. 6 down, 2 to go. Leave now or die. What shocked Harlem was not merely the violence, though the systematic execution of 6 men in 5 days was remarkable for its precision and effectiveness. What shocked everyone was how the violence was integrated with community organizing that made Schultz's operations impossible, even for the collectors and enforcers who were not on Johnson's kill list. Store owners throughout Harlem began refusing to allow Schultz's policy banks to operate in their buildings, claiming that police pressure had increased, or that they could not risk being associated with operations that were generating newspaper headlines about gang violence. Runners who collected bets for Schultz's organization began experiencing mysterious problems. Players would claim they had no money to bet that day. Collections would be smaller than expected. Betting slips would go missing. These were individually minor disruptions, but collectively, they represented coordinated resistance that reduced Schultz's revenue dramatically. Negro newspapers began running stories about the gang war in Harlem, but the framing was not neutral crime reporting. The stories described Dutch Schultz as a white gangster who had invaded Harlem, who had driven out colored operators through violence, who treated the community with contempt, who was now facing resistance from Harlem residents who wanted their neighborhood back. The stories identified the men being killed as Schultz's enforcers and collectors, making clear these were not innocent victims, but were people who had been extracting money from Harlem through intimidation. The effect was to generate sympathy for Johnson and hostility toward Schultz among people who might otherwise have been neutral about gang warfare. Ministers began preaching sermons about resisting exploitation and about standing up to outside forces that treated Harlem as territory to be conquered rather than as a community to be respected. The sermons did not explicitly endorse Johnson's violent campaign, but they created moral framework that portrayed Schultz as oppressor and resistance as justified. Saturday brought the seventh execution. Harold "Bunny" Weinstein, one of Schultz's top lieutenants who had been coordinating the Harlem operation, was found shot in the back of the head in his car on West 47th Street in Midtown Manhattan. The killing occurred outside Harlem, demonstrating that Johnson's reach extended beyond the neighborhood boundaries and that Schultz's people were not safe anywhere in New York. The note read, 7 down, 1 to go. Tomorrow. By Saturday evening, Dutch Schultz was in crisis. 7 of his key Harlem operatives were dead in 6 days, killed with such precision and such systematic efficiency that it was clear Johnson was working from a list, and had the capability to complete the list regardless of what precautions Schultz's people took. More importantly, Schultz's Harlem operations were collapsing economically even though the majority of his collectors and enforcers were still alive. Revenue had declined by more than half as players stopped betting and as runners experienced disruptions that prevented effective collections. Store owners were demanding that policy banks relocate. Police, responding to community pressure and to negative newspaper coverage, were conducting raids that had been avoided for months through bribery arrangements. Schultz's political protection was eroding as politicians calculated that being associated with a white gangster who was killing people in Harlem carried more political cost than whatever benefits Schultz's money provided. Sunday evening brought the 8th and final execution. Patrick O'Brien, Schultz's last remaining key operative in Harlem, was killed when his safe house in the Bronx was firebombed. Guards assigned to protect O'Brien were shot as they fled the burning building. O'Brien died in the fire, his body so badly burned that identification required dental records. The note, partially burned but still legible, read, 8 down, 0 to go. Harlem belongs to Harlem. Don't ever disrespect us again. Leave and never come back. Monday morning, September 23rd, Dutch Schultz received a message from Bumpy Johnson delivered through an intermediary. The message explained that 8 of Schultz's people were dead, that they had died because Schultz had chosen to publicly disrespect Johnson and had chosen to treat Harlem with contempt, that the killing would continue targeting Schultz's people in all territories, not just Harlem, until Schultz completely withdrew his operations from the neighborhood. The message offered no negotiation, no compromise, no alternative except complete withdrawal or continued systematic execution of Schultz's organization. By Tuesday evening, every one of Schultz's Harlem operations had been shut down. His policy banks were closed. His collectors had been withdrawn. His remaining enforcers had been reassigned to other territories. Schultz had abandoned 18 months of work and substantial investment, had retreated from Harlem rather than continue losing men to an opponent who had demonstrated the capability and the will to kill indefinitely. The story spread throughout New York's criminal underworld with remarkable speed, and the lesson was clear and shocking. Bumpy Johnson had accomplished what no colored gangster had done before. He had defeated a major white criminal organization, had driven Dutch Schultz out of Harlem through a combination of violence and community organizing, had demonstrated that colored criminals could match or exceed white gangsters in both tactical violence and strategic thinking. What shocked people was not merely that Johnson won the conflict. What shocked everyone was how Johnson won, by transforming a gang war into a community uprising, by combining killings with economic pressure and political mobilization, by framing the conflict in ways that generated public support rather than public fear. The methods Johnson pioneered during those 8 days in September 1935 would influence organized crime in Harlem for generations. The understanding that criminal operations in colored neighborhoods required community support rather than merely overwhelming force became accepted principle. The recognition that violence alone was insufficient to maintain control in the face of determined community resistance changed how criminals thought about territory and power. And the demonstration that colored gangsters could organize more effectively than white gangsters when fighting on their home territory established Johnson's reputation as someone who should never be underestimated or disrespected. Dutch Schultz never returned to Harlem. 1 month later, October 23, 1935, Schultz was killed in Newark by hitmen sent by other white gangsters who had decided he was too reckless, too likely to bring attention to organized crime, too dangerous to remain alive. His death was not directly related to the Harlem conflict, but people who knew the situation understood that Schultz's loss of Harlem had damaged his reputation sufficiently that other gangsters felt comfortable eliminating him without fear of retaliation from his organization. Bumpy Johnson took over the operations Schultz had abandoned, rebuilt them with colored management and community support, and created an empire that would last until his death in 1968. The empire was not built merely on violence or criminal capability, though Johnson possessed both in abundance. It was built on the lesson Johnson had demonstrated during 8 days in September 1935. That power in Harlem came not from being the most violent or the most ruthless, but from being part of the community, from understanding that residents would support operators who served them and would resist operators who exploited them, from recognizing that the strongest weapon was not guns but organized resistance that made outside control impossible. What happened between Monday, September 16th and Sunday, September 22nd, 1935, became legend in Harlem, told and retold for decades, as an example of how intelligence and community organizing could defeat superior force, how colored people could resist white exploitation when given leadership and strategy, how one man's refusal to accept humiliation could spark uprising that changed power dynamics in an entire neighborhood. The shock was not that violence occurred. Gang violence was common in 1935 New York. The shock was that violence was used as tool within larger strategy rather than as strategy itself, that killings were coordinated with economic pressure and political mobilization and community organizing to achieve results that violence alone could never produce. The shock was that Dutch Schultz, who had conquered Harlem through overwhelming force, was defeated by Bumpy Johnson, who used measured violence combined with community support to make Schultz's continued presence untenable. The shock was that 7 words spoken in the Cotton Club on Monday evening, 7 days then your people start dying, were not empty threat but were accurate prediction of systematic campaign that would eliminate 8 men and drive the most powerful white gangster in New York completely out of Harlem. That was what shocked Harlem. That was what changed organized crime. That was why Bumpy Johnson's response to Dutch Schultz's threat became the defining moment that established Johnson as more than merely dangerous criminal, but as strategic thinker who understood power in ways that would influence both criminal operations and civil rights organizing for generations to come. The insult that Dutch Schultz delivered at the Cotton Club that September evening, screaming racial epithets at Bumpy Johnson in front of 200 people, cost Schultz everything. His Harlem operations, 8 of his key people, his reputation for invincibility, and ultimately his life, though his death came from other sources who saw weakness where there should have been strength. Johnson emerged from the 8-day campaign not merely victorious, but transformed, recognized throughout New York as someone who combined criminal capability with strategic brilliance, someone who understood that real power came not from controlling territory through force, but from earning community support that made outside control impossible regardless of force applied.